All right, I think we'll probably go ahead and get started. I think we got a fairly good quorum of physicians and non-physician leaders across the system. I believe we have a few CEOs from the system, which is wonderful. Plus, we have our ALP leadership team. So today's topic is a dive into the gap, and this symbol really represents where we might be and where we've kind of come to be after a long period of time. On either part of this gap, if you can imagine, there's a physician, and then on the opposite end of this gap, there's the non-physician leaders. So the managers, executives, and hospital administrators are all sort of lumped into one group. And for the purposes of this talk, will be just considered management. The talk goes into sort of what the origins of this gap might be and what are some ways we can think of to be able to mend this gap. One thing that I recognize after doing this talk, after doing this journal club is, we've developed into accidental adversaries, and this is something that I hadn't really thought of. I think being a physician and being part of the medical system, it's something that we've all been exposed to, but I never thought of it this way, and I'm hoping to see if you all can think of it this way as well. Just an editorial note, this presentation is actually on Prezi, which is a pretty cool presentation tool, so it kind of swishes around all over the place. Unfortunately, that doesn't come across very well on live meetings, so this is not the Prezi topic. I'll send the email out with the Prezi link so you guys can all go through it in a different way, which may give a little bit better perspective. So on one end, you have hospital executives, and we'll call them blue suits, as the authors have called them in the articles that we kind of talk about. And on the other end, we have physicians, or the white coats. And it seems that we're conflicting in our goals. It seems that we're against each other, even though we're working within the same system. That has a lot to do with personal beliefs, background, education, and really overall goals. In terms of education, physicians, the white coats, primarily have all gone to medical school or a form of medical school. The medical school is primarily based on recognition and prevention of disease, differential diagnosis of disease. There's treatment effectiveness trials, and there's an art of medical humanities. As the Oath of Hippocrates states, it shall be for the good of the sick to the utmost of my power. That's the house we shall enter. And it means that do what you can and everything you can for the goodness of the patient. Well, that puts us in a predicament because we know very little from our training regarding the business of medicine. That includes how cost is structured, how the finances evolve. Very little training or official education goes into revenue, reimbursement, reductions. Very little training goes into how healthcare overall is regulated, whether it be locally in a hospital, through private regulators, or the government. Our focus as physicians primarily is clinical, focused on patient satisfaction, overall goals of care for that particular patient, try to do evidence-based medicine for them. Outcomes primarily measured by how patients fare in terms of their mortality and overall quality of life. At the back of all this is some things that are very personal. Physicians have a tendency to feel and feel the empowerment that's developed over time of being the captain of the ship, always trying to balance their work life and their family life. And obviously, from a revenue perspective, it's a very personal look. You're looking at it from what the expectations were you in medical school when you heard about how much certain physicians made or how much certain practices made and how that compares. While we manage all this, the reporting, really, the governing body over a physician is the medical board or that medical specialty's license, because that's what allows you to work and allows you to continue to function in that specialty. So as you can see by this reinforcing loop, as physicians continue to do more things that are focused on physicians, that's good. That reinforces back to being a better physician and to doing more clinically oriented things. But there's a problem. Always asked to do more with less finances, more with less personnel. There's an increasing complexity in entire healthcare, and there's an ever-expanding degree of mandates that are coming across, whether it be documentation, billing, coding, quality, reporting, overall leading to this feeling of powerlessness. Let's switch on over to the hospital execs. These are the blue suits. Well, this is a little bit varied. Most hospital execs have significantly varied backgrounds. There's a survey that was performed by the authors that's in the article, and that really showed that most hospital execs have advanced degrees. Most of them are either an MHA or public health or an MBA, and more than a majority of them have worked in management or finance as their prior position before entering into being executives. Only 9% of those surveyed in this particular cohort were MDs or RNs in their prior position. So a very different and very varied background to where the executives are coming in from where the physicians were. But they have a similar concern. They're asked to do more with less. There's ever-expanding mandates. There's financial constraints. There's fear of loss of personnel. There's fear that they don't have enough personnel to continue to function like they do. The complexity of how care is delivered, how care is reimbursed, and how care is organized is increasing over time. There's a great example in the last 50 years, the number of physicians and the number of medications that would have been seen a patient or given to a patient would have been tremendously lower than the amount that a patient sees now. Overall, the same feeling of powerlessness. So there is some parity there where both teams, though so varied in the background, in the end have the same feeling. So going forward to their focus, the focus is more operational. It's cost, complications, net revenue, efficiency, management, and the overall performance. And all of these tend to focus around how the operations of the facility are, and how those operations can be streamlined, how you can achieve targets that get us to the next step in the strategic focus. Of late, those targets were not necessarily all aligned with physicians. They were very much aligned in many ways across the country to measures that were relating to finances and operations. The reporting board is the governing board of the facility or the institution. It's not the medical board. It's a group of board of trustees or board of governors that each facility has to report to. And that's who they need to answer to continue to function and to continue to be allowed to exist as part of the system. So again, much like the reinforcing loop of physicians, you can see the reinforcing loop of the execs is the same. As the execs continue to focus on the operations, continue to function effectively, that will continue to increase things in their favor, that will keep the execs in existence, and that will allow the system to flourish. But the system's a little bit misaligned. There are two parts of this, as you can see on the seesaw, the physicians and the management, but they're kind of looked at it on different ends of the spectrum. One is a driver of the cost, and the other is the manager of the cost. The incentives for either team are misaligned. The incentives don't necessarily drive them to go in one direction, they tend to drive them to go in opposite directions. The patients, in the meanwhile, want the best, the most, and they want nothing out of their pockets. The payers want the least, the cheapest, and hopefully the best care they can offer. That again is adding stress to the system that doesn't necessarily align the players together. As you can see, this is an archetype from systems theory called accidental adversaries, and I think it fits absolutely perfectly with physicians and executives. As you can see, on the left side is a reinforcing loop of physicians. On the right side is a reinforcing loop of hospital execs. The negative feedback comes back when physicians only focus on physician-related issues. That doesn't necessarily align with that of hospital execs. When hospital execs focus solely on operational issues, that doesn't necessarily feed positively into physicians. The only way the system can work effectively is if there is a big shift. So there has to be some convergence of cultures. And this to me, it seems almost basic because there's no magic science behind this. But part of this really has to do with us understanding the other side And it's really going and seeing what is the background that somebody's coming from, what are the pressures on that particular individual, and recognize that we both face the same dilemma. We're both asked to do more with less. We're both asked to feel powerless, but we're both asked to do the same thing, and our goals really should be aligned. There are values that we share: altruism, and service-oriented. We're both very driven groups who like challenges, but it can only work together when we collaborate and trust. And a majority of what I found in the article had to focus on, we need to interact together as a group that trusts each other rather than distrusts each other, collaborates at more intervals rather than less. There were some skills of communication that both groups should probably effectively work on. Physicians have very little training in communication skills as part of medical school or prior, unless there's some other experience. But there is a lot of effort currently in this system and multiple others that focuses on communication. That has to do with understanding verbal and nonverbal cues, working on active listening to really understand and feel what the other person is saying, suspending judgment while you're listening to them, and most of all, being empathetic, really walking in the other person's shoes. This needs transparency. It needs accountability. For us to make a system that works, it has to be a win-win for both. If we work together as a team, it seems more effective based on the archetype than if we don't. If we work independently for our own benefits, it really doesn't necessarily benefit the system. Confrontation is something very difficult to address with physicians. It's something, that being the captain of the ship, having control is a very important thing. Being told what to do doesn't seem appropriate. But probably more structured dialogue, more inquiry into what it is that is affecting the physician, and really trying to understand the physician mentality, as well as physicians trying to understand the executive mentality, is going to be required for us to move forward. So what's the big shift? Well, you're going from a silo individualized function to a system, and really looking at us not as our own, as to kind of how or what we do, but really why we're all existing here. And in this, the answer to me after reading the article is clinical leadership. And that could be flipped the other way too. It could either be docs leading or leaders becoming more clinically oriented. It can work either way, but it needs to happen as a group, because if we need to focus on population health and outcomes, we also need to do it in a resource sensitive manner. We need to recognize that resources are limited, the pressures are felt across the board, but we can't overlook what's most important, and that for physicians is what's in the oath, and that is the importance of benefiting patients. So that is a bit of a summary of what the articles were about. Hopefully all of you at least had a chance to read them. I would like to open it up for some comments and questions, and I would love to hear opinions on both sides. So if you could kind of delve into what you felt reading the article, what struck out to you as something either you didn't know or something that changed how you felt.
This is Mary Sanfroca. I think what impressed me the most, and I think I kind of always knew it, but I just never really thought of it that way, is thinking in a systems way of thinking. And I think physicians aren't really taught to think that way. And physicians, traditionally went into private practice, and they were their own entity, and they didn't really think of themselves as being part of a bigger system that interacts with each other in a different way.
Excellent. I completely agree with you. I think there's very little in medicine that shows that you're part of something bigger than just yourself.
Well, and this is Sandy, and Mary, thanks for phrasing it that way, because one of the things that excited me about the article, and even more about your presentation, is even recognizing, like, there used to be an us and a them, or the blue suits and the white suits. And I love this final picture you even have up, which says actually there's a third way to look at this. And it's almost like this inability to manage agreement of how lots of people have this amazing expertise, all these similar things, but there's this third way we begin to frame up or look at or understand the issues. And I love this sort of third perspective you're offering, which is the big shift.
Thanks. Any opinions from some of the executives as to kind of what the article said or what you thought?
This is Deb Krompotty from Banner Estrella, and I found the article to be very validating in terms of what my experience has been and trying to, my training is clinical, so I'm a nurse, so I'm one of that 9% that you described or was described in the article. Mm-hmm. So I probably haven't had as big of, canyon to cross as I moved from clinical to administrative, and so it's interesting to hear those perspectives, but I think if you can focus on common goals, and that's what this article talked about, you do talk the same language, it's just sometimes you say it differently.
This is Rob. I thought it was kind of interested in kind of the common enemy, which is the system, and how frankly dysfunctional some of the way the system is set up. And again, I think kind of like what Deb said is kind of validating, because I think we're all frustrated with and trying to figure out how to improve the systems when sometimes the system isn't really designed to be logical, and the rules and regulations aren't necessarily logical.
Right, and I think, adding to that, the complexity of where things were versus where things are now is dramatically different. I mean, this might have worked 50, 60 years ago when there was just things were fairly straightforward. You paid cash when you came in, you saw the same doctor every time you saw them. There wasn't this other overarching regulatory body and lack of funding from every possible source around. But I think the pressures that are on the system right now are continuing to weaken it. I think both your points completely add to that. I think, one of the big things, at least within Banner, that we're doing with advancing and truly trying to form into an integrated health system, and one of the key steps to me is involving physicians in the conversation at each level. And that seemed to have been pointed out in the article, and that seems very consistent with other systems like Mayo or Cleveland Clinic or Geisinger and the others, where you're involving physicians at each level of the system. What are your thoughts on that?
Hey, this is Robert. I think one of the reasonable people tend to be reasonable people. And there are a lot of them around us, even though we may perceive them as being unreasonable. It's really a matter of their culture and base. And so I think it's really important for physicians to begin to understand what challenges the administrators are facing in trying to get from point A to point B. And until that context is clear, it becomes very, very difficult to have a conversation. Conversely, I think one of the most valuable undertakings that Banner has done, and kudos to Sandy and Margie and Charlie, is to also bring more leaders into the administrative conversation who have direct patient care experience, so that we're not inventing something that won't work. And so I think that two-way dialogue is critical. I think we need to do a better job of getting out to practicing physicians, during their busy schedules, look, this is the challenge that we're facing, and here's why the things happening around you are happening the way they are, and here's how you can help.
Agreed.
This is Rob Gould. So as I came out to this campus, one of the larger challenges that was identified up front was the challenge of communication between the medical staff and medical staff leadership and the leadership on the campus. And one of the first things that we did was try to eliminate and remove opportunities for lack of communication, and have put in place, our leadership retreats, for example. Right now, there's about 30 physicians that are invited to they're all the med exec leaders, and they're invited to all of our retreats. And we're expanding that. We're going to expand it to all anybody that leads in any manner, just like it is on the hospital side. So if you're a leader on the physician side, whether it's peer review or department chair, et cetera, you'll be invited to the leadership meetings as well, and as well as on the employed side for BPS, to take the physician leaders on that side and include them in the conversations about culture and challenges and strategies for the campus moving forward, so that we're doing it together instead of in the past you'd have med exec go on their retreat, the leadership team would have their retreat, and we'd somehow try and make it all fit during our med exec meetings, and we're trying to eliminate that.
Great. I'd like to echo Mary Sanfroca's point about systems thinking, and to me that was probably the nicest thing I found about this article, that I think is most applicable immediately for me in how I function on a day-to-day basis. It really is opposite to the way I have historically functioned in a particular unit or in a particular work environment, where you're really focusing on that particular unit. And this might be a focus for not just physicians, but also the executive side. I think it's very common for local executives to focus on local constraints and local function and local process, and make the local look better. When really we all need to function more as how does this affect the system, not just the system that we function in as Banner Health, but how it's going to affect care delivery in the entire region. And I think more and more of that conversation needs to occur at a grassroots level, rather than it occurring at a what we would call a system level, because at that point you're really detached from where change needs to occur. If the conversation occurs where the change needs to occur, change is more likely, in my opinion, to occur. So this type of thinking and more resources into getting physicians, in my opinion, even the non-physician leaders, thinking about the system as a whole rather than their department or their function is key.
And Shiva, this is Sandy. As you're saying that, I'm even thinking in my own world, we talk about adaptive leadership. We talk about metaphors of how we lead from the balcony and the dance floor. And even as you're saying that, I'm realizing even the way I think and the metaphors I've used and the models I've used around leadership are even expanding exponentially. And so I like your way of sort of pausing and noticing, how have we been communicating up until now, and what and how are the opportunities moving forward?
Thanks, Sandy. Sandy, do you have any insight into these three things? I had a little difficult time understanding them and how to utilize them to manage confrontation. They talked about the concept of appreciative inquiry and structured dialogue and positive deviance, and I had a little hard time grasping it and really how do you apply this on a day-to-day basis with other individuals that you have that confrontation with or system. Do you or anyone else on the call have any experience or more insight into these?
Well, I'm wanting to sound really smart and say something, but the truth is, I'm kind of marginal in confrontation myself. What I do know is the slide you showed before this around self-awareness, about people individually and collectively having higher awareness about when we're individually under stress, pressure, and task saturation, how do we tend to behave? And a lot of us think under conflict, we've got it all going on and we've got it hidden behind the curtain and no one can tell. But the fact is, Hogan has one assessment tool, there's others, that reveals under stress, pressure, task saturation, we may have these defaulted ways of of behaving. And so one thing I do know is self-awareness, especially under stress and pressure, is really critical. And then from that place, I know appreciative inquiry is similar to sort of powerful questions. And so the one way I've been trained is under stress and pressure, the power of asking a question rather than telling can facilitate ongoing communication or maintaining trust rather than what sometimes happens, which is we begin to tell each other things and erode trust.
That's great.
But it's very hard. When there's confrontation, we often will go to begin telling each other things.
This is Mary Sanfroca again. There was also a part in the article, and I can't reference the page number, but where they talked about that the answers frequently come from the bottom, and the answers frequently come from talking to the people that you work with and getting their input as to what the issues are and what the solutions are, and it comes all comes back to leading from the bottom rather than leading from the top down.
That's good.
Yeah,
Okay, what's your observation of how that happens in the workplace? Do you think we as people default to that or not? Or are we building more awareness around that? Or what's your observation around that?
Well, they talked about it a little bit in the article that, physicians are taught to be very authoritative and they're taught that they should be giving the answers rather than asking the questions. And that and you alluded to it yourself, that really we should be asking more questions, and then the answers would kind of come more organically to that process rather than just trying to come up with an answer and forcing everybody to kind of go along with it.
Catherine Perkins found an article, and I think we're going to include it in the orientation workbook for cohort 3. And Mary, it actually came from some feedback you gave. It's an article, I think the title is called Whiplash, and it talks about, some of the points you're bringing up here, this phenomenon going on about how a physician may be trained in communication more in an authoritarian way, one-on-one with patients, and yet to move into a leadership role, recognize how that communication style may not be as effective. And so the title of the article is Whiplash, about how to perhaps unlearn some communication skills when not in the clinical setting, and how to relearn or expand communication skills in leadership roles.
And, I think to a certain extent this job taught me that, because when you're building a new cancer center from the ground up and you're building something where it didn't exist before, your immediate instinct as a physician is, oh my God, how is this going to work? What's the answer to this specific problem?
Yeah.
And to learn how to turn that around and say, it's not just me alone, I'm working with a team. How can we come up with the answer rather than I come up with the answer? Because otherwise I think I would have gone criminally insane by now.
Yeah. No,
We're glad you're here.
So I think I kind of had to learn that lesson, otherwise I would have, God knows what.
And, this is Robert Groves talking again. I absolutely agree that all of those are critical skills to develop as individual leaders, but I want to go back to something that Rob Gould was talking about earlier, which is if we don't frame the problems together, then sometimes we're working on good solutions to different problems.
Agreed.
And so I like the idea of having the medical staff and the administrative staff meet together and say, okay, here are the external challenges that we face. Together, we need to come up with a solution that works for everybody. Everybody's going to have to give a little. Everybody's going to have to, contribute. But together, we need to solve this problem. If you don't go through that framing, then bottom-up leadership doesn't work, because the folks that are at the bedside are working on solutions to very different problems.
Excellent point, Robert. And I think that's a great way to put it, as to we're not figuring out the solution. We're still we need to frame the problem together. And that's a really important point, because you're right. We see that all the time where we're working on entirely separate issues that in very many ways are conflicting, that where what we are working on will actively make what the other side's working on worse. If we're on one physician side want to add more resources, while the goal is to improve the bottom line, that may not match. And sometimes we're working against each other, which is why I think this to me, this diagram, just looking at it, really embodies a lot of what you said.
This is Deb Kropotnik. I saw an exercise once where you had to switch roles, and if you were a physician, you became an administrator and vice versa, and you had to argue the points and poke holes in the other argument, and it really was an eye-opening experience as you began to figure out how people think and then get some feedback on that.
Great. One thing that doesn't happen very often is there isn't time for this in a normal clinical workflow. When you look at regular physicians that are coming in, they're seeing patients, there isn't sort of a dedicated time where you say, this is self-awareness. And it's not just my personal self-awareness, it's self-awareness of the team that you're functioning with. For you to do that, there needs to be some time, or there needs to be an activity like you just mentioned. And that needs to happen as something that you plan and organize. It doesn't just happen on its own. I mean, like the ALP course is doing for a lot of the physician leaders now. But the end that we're working for is quite large. And how do you expose the rest of those physicians to that self-awareness?
Well, Shiva, kudos to you for carving out time today for this conversation. I mean, I'm looking at the article you offered, and I have places that I'd like to take that. So kudos to you for that. The other thing that's going to be, I want to go back to something Robert said. I know Ronald Hypritz talks about how critical it is to frame the problems, and one of the models he talks about is identifying, I just looked it up, the 6 principles for leading adaptive work. And he actually says to support major change, the first one's actually to get up on the balcony. The second one is actually bringing together key stakeholders of different perspectives to identify the problem. So what Mary said, what Robert said, what you said, this is a really great way to build our awareness of how blue suits and white suits and all kinds of people, really to remember that part of the work is identifying the problem before we move into, and then he has step 3 is regulating the stress, maintain discipline, giving the work back to the people, and protecting voices of leadership from below. So kudos to me for this conversation to remind me that part of the work is sometimes bringing together key people to actually identify the issue.
Cool. Excellent. Any other thoughts?
And, Shirley, the question you asked is a difficult one. We have everybody working at a pretty high stress level already, or I shouldn't say everybody, but most physicians are like hamsters on a wheel.
Yeah.
They don't have time to get off and even get a sip of water. And so the answer has to be that somehow we begin to bleed that information into already existing structures. And I think what happens then is there are members of that group who will have aha moments and develop a passion for spreading the word in hallway conversations, in doctors' lounge conversations. But somehow we've got to start, and that's why I like what Rob was describing so much, is that's an existing structure. The medical staff does a retreat every year. There's a medical staff leadership setup, required at every single facility. Now, we need to take a step back and say, okay, how does this apply to the outpatient setting? And what are the structures there? And it's things like BHN and like VMG. But it's very important for us to begin thinking in the way that Rob did about how do we actually use existing structures to begin to get this information and these sorts of insights out there, because what they are at the end of the day is empowering. If I understand the problem, no matter how challenging it may be, if I understand it and I know what my tools are to address it, that is instant empowerment that is light years ahead of being in the dark and wondering what the heck is going to happen to me next.
Great. But, don't you think at some level for physicians, the incentives, that are misaligned do need to align to things like systems thinking? We need to incentivize physicians to think of not themselves or even their facility, but more of the system. and that might help some of that alignment.
I think that's occurring. Again, that's what the really encouraging part of this article was, that people are taking the time to try and understand one another. People are trying to align incentives wherever possible, and when not possible, again, it's back to defining them and identifying them. If you don't know that you have an issue, you're not going to figure out solutions or figure out how to live with that issue. And that's what the dialogue starts to create, is this, it's more of a community and more of a broader thinking. And you've got to bring in others and think about things that are happening outside your facility, and spend an awful lot of time figuring out, system approaches to the challenges, because that's, again, back to the article, that's one of the biggest challenges, that our systems aren't always effective. But again, the dialogue is the only way you're going to start to move that bar.
Are physicians the only ones late to this game? I mean, it feels, whenever I read one of these things, it always seems to me that, wow, we're so late to this. I mean, it just seems, is there things within this system that the other side, or the non-physician side is late to, where they're just recognizing, oh yeah, that's important too?
A great question.
Well, I think